When you hear the name Ernest Hemingway, you probably think of his well-drawn, character-driven novels about warfare, masculinity, excessive drinking, and fishermen. Hemingway is still considered one of the greatest American novelists of all time. But when he wasn't at his typewriter, the American literary titan was an international spy who turned out to be a little more like Boris Badenov than James Bond. So, today we're going to take a look at how Ernest Hemingway was secretly hired as a KGB spy and totally sucked at it. But before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the Weird History channel and let us know in the comments below what other famous writer topics you would like to hear about. Okay, so now let's take a look at the story of the Old Man and the Sea, CCP. Born in Oak Park, Illinois on July 21, 1899, Ernest Hemingway lived in the United States for most of his 61 years of life. He had 4 wives and worked as a war correspondent in the 1920s and a journalist during the Spanish Civil War. He would become world famous for his great literary works like A Farewell to Arms, For Whom the Bell Tolls, and The Old Man and the Sea, among others. And he would even win a Nobel Prize for Literature in 1954. However, in addition to being a wordsmith, Hemingway was also a bit of a world traveler. And it was this international cavorting that would eventually get him involved in the whole clandestine operative thing. At the time, the whole thing was very hush-hush, and the secret would stay buried for decades. While Ernest Hemingway shuffled off his mortal coil way back in 1961, the stories about the time he spent spying for the Soviets didn't come out until nearly 50 years later. It wasn't until actually 2009 when a book was released that detailed the personal notes of a former KGB officer, Alexander Vassiliev. Since Vassiliev was granted access to archives as far back as the Stalinist period, the book was full of juicy insider information on the notorious Russian intelligence agency. His research provided an unprecedented look at the inner workings of the KGB and its predecessor, the NKVD. It was in these archives that Vassiliev first found the details of Ernest Hemingway's career as a dilettante spy. Ernest Hemingway may not have been a trained professional spy, but he was a serious enough asset for the Soviets to give him his own code name, Argo. The Argo, of course, was the boat that ferried the mythical Jason and the Argonauts on their quest to find the Golden Fleece. It was a fitting enough moniker for a man as associated with the sea as Hemingway was. While the code name certainly provided cover to the writer during his clandestine operations, it's also believed to have another, slightly more amusing purpose. It was meant to flatter Hemingway and make him feel like a real secret agent. The tactic apparently worked, and Hemingway turned out to be incredibly enthusiastic about working for the Soviets. So how was it that one of America's greatest literary treasures wound up spying for the Soviets? Were they blackmailing him? Using mind control? Did they have a P-tape? The answer is no. According to Vassiliev's notes, the author of The Sun Also Rises repeatedly expressed his desire and willingness to help the Russians. In 1941, he was approached by the NKVD, a predecessor agency to the KGB. Vassiliev confirms that the recruiters didn't have to do much convincing in order to get the author to agree to work for them. In fact, Hemingway received no money for services, an arrangement the Soviets called ideological recruitment. In other words, Hemingway wasn't being bribed or forced or tricked into being a spy. He was a true believer. During the early part of his life, Ernest Hemingway had little to no interest in politics. But all that changed with the advent of the Spanish Civil War in 1936. Hemingway got a first-hand look at the conflict as a journalist, and he didn't like what he saw, particularly from Francisco Franco and fascists in general. The man who one day would be called Papa became virulently anti-fascist, and he greatly appreciated the aid the Soviets were sending to the anti-fascist forces in Spain. In fact, that was the experience that laid the groundwork for Hemingway's eventual ideological recruitment by the NKVD. Their mutual hatred of fascism made them natural partners. Hemingway was first recruited by the NKVD in New York City by an agent named Jacob Golos. And just like James Bond, being a secret agent meant trotting all over the globe. Throughout the 1940s, Hemingway continued to have clandestine meetings with Soviet agents in various exotic locations. The famous author loved nothing more than to fish off the coast of Cuba, and he also owned a home there. This made Havana a logical meeting spot, and that city was often used as the setting for their rendezvous. But the well-traveled literary prodigy also met with the Soviets in London. In fact, Hemingway's travel habits may have been a key to the whole arrangement. According to Vasiliev's account, it was very likely a 1941 trip to China that first attracted the Soviets' attention to the author. Both the NKVD and the KGB were masters of spycraft and espionage, and both were famous for employing sleeper agents and effortlessly staging mysterious assassinations. Despite this, Hemingway believed he could help them get a little better at what they do. In fact, when he was first recruited, Hemingway presented the Soviets with a set of stamps and then instructed Agent Jacob Golos to give the stamps to anyone who would be meeting with Hemingway as a means of authentication. While the Soviets probably didn't need Hemingway to explain spycraft to them, the idea might have made a good conceit for one of his books. Given the history of the Cold War and the long-standing animosity between the U.S. and Soviet Union, the initial reaction most people have to learning that Ernest Hemingway was a spy for the Soviets is to assume it was a treacherous act. However, this analysis might be based on an anachronism. During the 1940s, when all of Hemingway's spying missions occurred, the URSSR and the Americans were actually allies. The two superpowers were still united in their fight to crush fascism in Europe, and the Cold War wasn't quite on the horizon yet. Hemingway likely felt no compunction over working for the Soviets, and it's not clear he really should have, at least at that time. But as the years went on and the political situation began to change, the writers started to realize the arrangement didn't make him look too good. Ernest Hemingway may have started out as a spy for the Soviets, but he didn't offer his services to them exclusively. When the Second World War broke out, Hemingway actually approached the United States Office of Strategic Services, which was a predecessor to the CIA. Long story short, he offered to help out by working as a spy for them too. Whether they really wanted his services or to keep an eye on him, or they were just amused to get the chance to work with Ernest Hemingway, the CIA accepted. One of Hemingway's missions for the U.S. involved tracking U-boats with his fishing vessel, Pilar, in the waters of the Caribbean. Hemingway actually concocted a way to use high-life players to defend his boat if the need should arise. He figured the players would be able to throw grenades into the conning towers of German submarines. He never got a chance to try it, but hey, points for imagination. While the whole idea of a world-famous literary titan secretly working as an international spy sounds like the setup for an incredible movie, the reality of it wasn't really all that impressive. According to Hemingway's file in the KGB records, his work failed to produce any political information. The file went on to note that the author was never verified in practical work. In other words, Hemingway may have been one of America's greatest writers, but he was also one of the URSSR's worst spies. He was bad at the job, and the Soviets never learned anything from him. Following the end of World War II, the era of McCarthyism began in the United States, and with it, a witch hunt for communists and communist sympathizers. Hemingway became deeply concerned that this work for the Soviets would come to light and be misinterpreted in the new political atmosphere, which was a reasonable concern. In private letters to a friend who was also an officer in the U.S. Army, Hemingway admitted he was scared of being dragged in front of a committee and forced to publicly explain his career as a Soviet spy. He never indicated that he believed he had betrayed his country, but he knew very well that many individuals had been blacklisted or even jailed for far, far less. In his golden years, Hemingway became convinced that the FBI was spying on him and that they were following him everywhere he went. This belief, which many considered paranoid, was grounded in the history he had with the Soviets. He knew he had communist skeletons in his closet, and he lived in a perpetual state of fear that they would be exposed. Early on the morning of July 2, 1961, Ernest Hemingway used a double-barrel shotgun to take his own life. Among other factors, his suicide was largely attributed to his belief that the FBI was out to get him. Years later, records would reveal that J. Edgar Hoover had, in fact, ordered a long-term surveillance of the writer. This included watching him and tapping his phones. Hoover was interested in Hemingway on account of his time living in Cuba. So Hemingway was right about being watched by the feds. Maybe he wasn't so bad at the whole spycraft thing after all. You may not be familiar with the name Vasily Arkhipov, but since he's been called the man who saved the world, maybe you should be. Long story short, he's the Soviet Navy man who stopped a nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis in the 60s. So, today, we're going to take a look at the Soviet soldier who single-handedly saved the world from nuclear annihilation. Okay, so let's take a look at when the Cold War almost got real hot. In October of 1962, U.S. President John F. Kennedy was given some intelligence collected by a U-2 reconnaissance aircraft, which revealed that the Soviet Union had covertly put several nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. At the time, President John F. Kennedy was still reeling after failing to overthrow Fidel Castro during the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961. So, learning that Cuba and the Soviet Union joined forces to construct ballistic missile facilities in Cuba was, obviously, not particularly good news. On October 22, 1962, Kennedy addressed the nation on television. He informed Americans about the presence of the missiles and the reasons behind why he had decided to place a naval blockade around Cuba. He made it clear that the U.S. perceived the missiles as a direct threat to national security and that he was prepared to authorize military force to neutralize that threat if it became necessary. Never in the history of the world had the threat of full-scale nuclear war seemed so immediate, and many feared the worst would come to pass. For the next 13 days, Kennedy and Premier Nikita Khrushchev played a game of political cat and mouse that nearly led to the world's first nuclear war. When U.S. destroyers were ordered to quarantine the area around Cuba, they lacked one crucial detail about the 3 Soviet submarines they encountered there. Namely, that these subs housed nuclear weapons on board. Neither U.S. naval intelligence, anti-submarine warfare forces, nor anyone else in the United States military intelligence pipeline had any idea that the subs were armed with powerful warheads. But they were. In fact, each of the submarines had 22 torpedoes, and one torpedo on each sub contained a 15-kiloton warhead that could travel 12 miles. Meanwhile, unknowingly risking nuclear holocaust, the Americans fired depth charges at the submarines to try to get them to surface. Talk about your close calls. The crew on the Soviet subs felt trapped in their situation. Conditions inside were unlivable, and the Americans kept sending warning shots their way. Communications intelligence officer Vadim Orlov later recalled, "The Americans hit us with something stronger than the grenades, apparently with a practical depth bomb. We thought, that's it, the end." According to Orlov, Captain Second Rank Valentin Grigorovich Savitsky then yelled, "Maybe the war has already started up there. We're going to blast them, now. We will die, but we will sink them all. We will not disgrace our Navy." The crew's original destination had been Cuba before they were diverted and ordered to stop in the Caribbean. The crew, however, did not know the reason behind the diversion. The men on the Soviet sub had gone silent days before the crisis had started, so they were unaware of what was happening on the surface. Orlov, who spent some time in the United States, learned from American radio that Russia had planted missiles in Cuba and Cuba had shot down an American spy plane. He also heard that the U.S. Navy had blocked anyone from coming near the island, but the submarine crew was wary of American media reports. As far as the crew was concerned, they had every reason to believe that war had begun. When Savitsky ordered that torpedo to be armed, regulations designed to prevent a single man from starting a war required him to get approval from 3 senior officials on board. While the second-in-command agreed, Flotilla Commander Vasily Alexandrovich Arkhipov, who was equal to Savitsky in rank, did not. Arkhipov did not believe the Americans were attacking the Soviet sub. Instead, he thought they were signaling them to surface. As evidence, he noted their depth charges never made contact with B-59. It's unclear what Arkhipov said to stop Savitsky from starting a nuclear war, but thank the Lord, his words were apparently very persuasive. According to Arhipov's wife, the commander was a quiet and gentle man, so it's possible that it was mainly his demeanor that helped calm Savitsky down and change his mind. After the confrontation, the missile was not readied for firing. Instead, the Russian sub rose to the surface, where it was met by a U.S. destroyer. Yet the Americans did not board and there was no inspections conducted, so the U.S. Navy had no idea that there were nuclear torpedoes on those subs. In fact, that wouldn't be known for about another 50 years, when the former antagonists met at a 50th reunion. Instead, the Russians turned away from Cuba and headed north back to Russia. A captain on one of the Soviet subs, Vyory Ketov, later recalled that Captain Savitsky had tried to avoid coming into contact with American anti-submarine warfare forces. However, the battery on Savitsky's submarine died, and he had no choice but to rise to the surface to recharge. Ketov reports that, while surfacing, Savitsky's boat came under machine gun fire from a U.S. ASW-S2 tracker aircraft, and the shots landed both to the sides of the submarine's hull and near the bow. These actions, which the Russians viewed as provocative, were carried out by surface ships in close proximity, as well as anti-submarine aircraft flying roughly 10 to 15 meters, or less than 30 to 50 feet, above the boat. According to Ketov, the gunfire had a detrimental impact on the commander, prompting him to take extreme measures, the use of special weapons. According to Martin J. Sherwin, a member of an anti-submarine warfare squadron flight crew, U.S. forces had been ordered not to fire live ammunition near the submarine. So that raises the question, why did they do it? Well, nobody knows for sure, but it is possible that the tracker crew didn't receive the order. It's also possible they were jacked up after having spent 2 days following the submarine and wanted to prove who was boss. Whatever the case, it's almost certain that they had no idea that their actions could have resulted in World War III. In his account of the events, Ketov recalled that mere chance prevented Savitsky from resorting to the use of special weapons during the encounter. In fact, it was a delay in diving time and the prudence of the brigade's chief of staff, Vasily Arkhipov, who happened to be on board, which prevented the combat operations which the sub could have initiated. Savitsky's B-59, designated Foxtrot class by NATO, was equipped with a standard propulsion system. The sub's 3 diesel engines were linked to several batteries that would run out of power if they weren't regularly charged. U.S. forces were taunting Savitsky's submarine with hand grenades and other minor explosives, and Savitsky avoided resurfacing to recharge the batteries. Meanwhile, the men inside the submarine were suffering immensely. The water in the Caribbean was very warm, and it enveloped the submarine, causing it to heat up. The lowest temperature inside was 113 degrees Fahrenheit, while the temperature in the engine room peaked at 140 degrees. Unfortunately for the Russian sailors, the Foxtrot submarines were not equipped with air conditioning because the vessels were supposed to be deployed in cooler waters. The air inside was putrid, and there was little fresh water. The crewmen got rashes and ulcers because of the hot, sticky environment. They looked so bad and sickly that some later compared their appearance to that of Holocaust survivors. Experts agree that had the Soviet sub fired nuclear torpedoes during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the United States would have responded in kind, and U.S. aircraft carriers in the area were indeed carrying nuclear depth charges. It's unclear what specifically catastrophic results such a nuclear war would have had on the world, but pretty much everyone agrees it would have been extremely bad for both countries involved. Luckily, after 13 days of intense negotiations, President Kennedy and Premier Nikita Khrushchev came to an agreement, and the threat of a deliberate nuclear war was also averted. Khrushchev removed the missiles from Cuba, and the United States, in exchange, promised not to attack the island. Although it wasn't made public at the time, the United States also agreed to remove their own nuclear missiles from Turkey. 1 year later, the United States, United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union would even partially ban the testing of nuclear weapons. Meanwhile, Arkhipov's actions to prevent nuclear disaster were reportedly accepted by the Soviet government, and he was not reprimanded for his actions. In fact, he later received a promotion, which was a good thing, since preventing an accidental nuclear war seems like exactly the kind of behavior a military should want to encourage. And according to Thomas Blanton, former director of the United States National Security Archive, Arkhipov saved the world. Notably, this wasn't the first time Arkhipov kept his cool and averted disaster during a tense situation. 1 year prior, Arkhipov was stationed on the Soviet submarine K-19. And on-board nuclear reactors started to break down after the coolant system stopped working. In order to avoid a nuclear meltdown, Arkhipov ordered his crew to come up with a fix. They had no choice because the system did not have a backup. As a result of their efforts, Arhipov and other crew members endured radiation exposure, which obviously was not ideal, but was definitely preferable to dying in a nuclear meltdown. 2 years later, 22 K-19 crew members died from that exposure. Arhipov lived for another 37 years, but his eventual kidney cancer was blamed on the radiation. He died August 19, 1998. In 2017, threats made by North Korean leader Kim Jong-un to fire missiles at Guam, a U.S. territory, resurfaced tensions like those that ran rampant during the Cold War. All one can hope is that there are still a few Arhipovs around to handle situations like these. Lurking within the shadows of Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union was a system of forced labor camps known as the Gulag. Gulags were nightmarish prisons containing anywhere from 2,000 to 10,000 prisoners apiece. If you were unlucky enough to find yourself as one of those prisoners, you would be subjected to backbreaking labor, brutality, extreme weather, starvation, and disease. Today on Weird History, we're exploring what life was like for a prisoner in the Soviet Gulag. Okay, time to take a disturbing trip back to the URSSR. And we don't mean we're taking a drive in a Moskvich. The Gulag was notorious for imprisoning people based on false or even non-existent charges, including treason, spying, and anti-revolutionary activity. Sympathy toward anyone perceived to be enemy of the state could also be punished with a trip to the camps. That means if Rocky had lost Ivan Drago, not only would he have been shipped off to the Gulag, but so would Paulie. And probably the robot as well. The Soviet Union relied on these flimsy pretexts to incarcerate anyone they pleased. But the real reason was the economic value of prisoners as slave labor. Stalin's aggressive 5-year plan, an effort to quickly bring industrialization to the Soviet Union, required a huge amount of labor for its massive construction projects. The only problem? A lack of knowledgeable and skilled specialists who could do the work. So Stalin's plan created enormous labor camps to get the job done. A guy who has sketchy facial hair with an ambitious business model that relies on unpaid labor. Sounds like a tech startup CEO to me. Millions of people were arrested, deported to the Gulag, and forced to become the builders of Stalin's dream. Camp survivors shared chilling stories of being picked up by secret police and shipped off to the Gulag without a trial. Unsuspecting citizens could be snatched up while at work, in the middle of having a meal at a restaurant, walking down the street, or even asleep in their beds. And Stalin had another steady source of workers that was even more disturbing. The Russian Civil War claimed the lives of over 8 million civilians and 800,000 soldiers, leaving millions of children homeless throughout the 1920s and 30s. Desperate to live, some of these children turned to crime to survive, and were often rounded up and sent to the Gulag to bolster Stalin's workforce. You are never too young to swing a hammer for the motherland. Following a terrible interrogation, prisoners would be loaded onto a cattle car with others, sometimes waiting days for the train to depart for the Gulag. Conditions on the train were subhuman. Prisoners were given nothing but salted fish to eat, and the only toilet was a hole in the floor. Many succumbed to dehydration and extreme heat or cold before they even arrived at the Gulag. World War II proved to be another boon for the Gulag, and not in the way you might expect. After the Germans invaded the Western Soviet Union in the summer of 1941, the Red Army beat a hasty, chaotic retreat as Hitler's forces swarmed over the land. Eventually, the Soviets regained control, prompting Stalin to issue Order No. 270 in 1941, which stated that any Red Army soldier who was captured or retreated would face a terrible punishment. Not only would they have to deal with the consequences of their actions, which in some cases would mean being shipped off to a German POW camp, but in addition, their families would be denied food and potentially be sent straight to the Gulag. Basically, your options were either win or be slain on the battlefield. Otherwise, your family would be breaking rocks in a labor camp. As if that wasn't bad enough, Gulag prisoners were assigned to special penal battalions and sent to the front lines of the war. Some would cross minefields, clearing them for other soldiers to cross. Others were effectively used as human shields to protect the good soldiers. Anyone who tried to make a run for it would be gunned down by special blocking units with strict orders to fire upon deserting prisoners. Still, getting blown up by a mine or shot by Germans and/or your fellow countrymen might have been a better deal than actually having to live in the Gulag. Following the hellish train ride to the Gulag, inmates had to contend with the harsh reality of daily life in the prison, where countless lives were claimed by disease, accidents, violence, and exposure. Food was always in short supply, and most camps provided almost no clothing or shelter. The barracks were often nothing more than ramshackle wooden shacks, offering scant protection from the elements. When you consider the fact that some camps were located north of the Arctic Circle, having nothing but a rickety lean-to shield you from the cold spelled certain doom for a number of prisoners. The only clothing prisoners might receive were padded jackets, with the occasional hat or set of mittens. And what little food they were given lacked nutrition. Guards basically controlled every part of a person's life in the Gulag, and their mood could determine how much food, clothing, or water a prisoner would get each day. And the camp's administrators often dangled food in front of desperate prisoners to incentivize them to work harder. It was like being sentenced to an endless team-building exercise where you're encouraged to die, so your boss has less paperwork. The severe lack of resources led to hoarding. Tobacco, food, shoes, and even sewing needles essentially became a form of currency. Gambling and bartering and fights occurred over these basic items, with prisoners sometimes killing for them. Even though Stalin's regime regularly invented charges to send innocent people to supply their workforces at the Gulag, the camps were also home to actual criminals, including bandits, thieves, and murderers. These real criminals were the elites of the camp, often sporting specific tattoos related to Russian orthodoxy and culture, and terrorizing other inmates. The gangs controlled virtually every aspect of social life, including who slept where and how food was rationed, and challenging their authority could mean beatings, stabbings, additional hard labor, or worse. Consequently, many prisoners feared the gangs more than the actual guards. Stalin's bold vision of jail, but worse than outside, was no walk in the park for anyone. But women had things especially rough. Many of the female inmates were initially arrested as daughters of enemies of state, meaning they weren't even guilty of any direct offense, real or invented. When they were arrested, mothers were separated from their children, and in the camps, they were expected to perform the same hard labor as men. And even though male and female prisoners were separated, women in the Gulag still faced the threat of being assaulted by guards and male prisoners. Some women were forced to take on Gulag husbands, exchanging sexual favors for protection and better treatment. And there weren't exactly safe birth control methods either. When a woman gave birth in the Gulag, the baby stayed with the mother until the age of 2. The combination of poor nutrition, lousy sanitary conditions, and lack of basic necessities tragically cut short many of these infant lives, and some of those who survived developed serious mental and physical ailments. But despite all these abominable conditions, some people managed to find romance in the Gulag, and many accounts of these personal experiences still survive today. In one account, published in Orlando Fige's Just Send Me Word, a true story of love and survival in the Gulag, the story of inmate Svieta and her lost love, Lev, unfold through their letters to each other. When the author interviewed them, he found their love got her through her incarceration. Figes writes, Svieta had much less to say, but she sat with Lev and held his hand. And when I asked her what had made her fall in love with him, she replied, I knew he was my future. When he was not there, I would look for him, and he would always appear by my side. That is love. Exposure to the elements and harsh conditions weren't the only terrible things the Gulag had in store for its prisoners. Out of the 18 million unfortunate souls incarcerated in the Gulag, many came from diverse professional backgrounds. Doctors, writers, educators, farmers, students, and other people from all walks of life were constantly arrested and shipped off to do hard physical labor, for which they had neither the skill nor the conditioning to safely perform. There's a reason you don't generally hire art students to build a railroad or fix a power line. But Stalin wasn't particularly interested in anyone's well-being, and like most dictators, he'd had the foresight to make it illegal for him to be held accountable for any of his actions. Some inmates cut down trees, while others mined for minerals or did other menial tasks, depending on the camp's location. And since this was years before OSHA was invented, and also Stalinist Russia, safety precautions and personal protective gear weren't given a second thought. Prisoners often worked with no more protection than the clothing they had on their backs, and used primitive hand tools instead of quality equipment, all while working grueling hours in extreme conditions. As a result, thousands of lives were claimed by accidents, freezing, and sheer exhaustion. It wasn't uncommon for a prisoner to be literally worked to death. But with a constant supply of new laborers in the form of criminals, orphans, and dissidents being fed into the camps, Stalin and his inner circle hardly noticed. They had bigger fish to fry. One of those bigger fish? The creation of shipping channels and a Russian navy. To make this a reality, 2 new canals needed to be constructed. The canals would run north and south, requiring extensive labor in a short period of time. An impossible amount of work with an equally impossible time frame. Sounds like a job for the unfortunate prisoners of the Gulag. In 1931, thousands of inmates were transported to the construction zones. There, prisoners dug a 30-mile addition to the White Sea-Baltic Canal. The project took almost 2 years and was mostly dug by hand. An estimated 12,000 prisoners lost their lives building the canal, although the actual toll is probably higher. Between 1933 and 1937, the same project unfolded in much the same way along the Moscow-Volga Canal. This time, however, it took twice as long and covered 80 miles. The thousands who perished digging the Moscow-Volga addition were buried in the soil before the canal was flooded over. Today, tourists traveling down the Moscow-Volga Canal are actually sailing over a mass underwater grave. But it was a small price to pay for Stalin to get his Amazon deliveries on time. As you may imagine, escaping the Gulag was a difficult feat. Even if you managed to get past the guards and the dangerous Gulag gangs, you still had to contend with the harsh Russian wilderness and find your way to a country that wouldn't immediately turn you right back over to Stalin. The only two options were Finland and China. For those who actually succeeded in making a great escape, those countries became a safe haven. One notable escape involved a Polish army official named Sławomir Rawicz, who crossed the Himalayas to India on foot. Rawicz dictated the details of his adventure in a 1956 book titled The Long Walk. Despite being somewhat disputed, the story inspired the 2010 film The Way Back, starring Jim Sturgis, a fact which is either a tribute or an indictment of Rawicz, depending on how you feel about Across the Universe. A verified escape did happen in 1933, involving a man named Vladimir Chernyavin. When he was transferred to Karelia, near the Finnish border, Chernyavin befriended a local peasant who supplied valuable information about the habits of the camp's guards. Chernyavin used this information to find an escape opportunity. Because of his good behavior, guards allowed his wife and son to visit him in the prison. He and his wife established a code to discuss their escape plan, and in the summer of 1933, the family put their plan into motion. During a scheduled visit, Chernyavin and his family managed to give the Gulag guard the slip. Per Chernyvin's account, the family crossed rivers, forests, and mountains on their journey. By traveling on foot and camping in the wilderness with few provisions, they managed to elude detection and make it to a hidden boat, which they used to sail to Finland. After establishing their safety in Finland, Chernyavin and his family emigrated to England to live out the rest of their lives. Man, that's a family story that beats the time we got banned from the theme park. At the time of Stalin's death in 1953, the Gulag held over 3 million prisoners. On paper, it had been a comparatively normal work camp administration, but with Stalin gone, the horrors of the camps became publicly known. Not only was it a cruel and inhumane system, but despite Stalin's insistence that it was necessary to complete his 5-year plan, the Gulag was economically useless. The ends didn't even justify the means. Turns out, you just couldn't trust Uncle Joe. Russia's new premier, Nikita Khrushchev, began a process of de-Stalinization known as the Thaw, which included the immediate release of millions of Gulag inmates. But even after surviving the Gulag, many were so traumatized by their imprisonment that they remained fearful of discussing it for the rest of their days. The grim legacy of the Gulag is well known to history, but for those who lived through it and their descendants, the wounds may never fully heal. Just below the Arctic Circle, between Russia and Alaska, lie two tiny land masses, the Diomede Islands. Diomede culture is a unique synthesis of American, Russian, and native influences, creating a fascinating and complex dynamic. So, today we're going to take a look at what life is like in the Diomedes, the two tiny islands on the border between Russia and Alaska. Okay, get your winter coat on, because we're Alaska-bound for a cold snap of weird history. Thousands of years ago, the Bering Land Bridge, situated between modern-day Russia and Alaska, served as a crucial passage for trade and exploration. But after the end of the last ice age, right around 13,000 years ago, it disappeared beneath the sea, leaving the Bering Strait in its place. Typical land bridge, always disappearing, and they never leave a forwarding address. Big Diomede and Little Diomede are two neighboring islands located in the middle of that strait, just off the Alaskan coast. The border between Russia and America lies in the gap between the two islands, which is just over 2 miles wide. Big Diomede is considered Russian territory, while Little Diomede is considered part of Alaska. Listen, it isn't the size of the Diomede that counts, it's how you use it in a trade dispute. When the Soviet government imposed strict rules against Americans crossing the Bering Strait in the 1930s, the Diomede Islands were unexpectedly caught in the middle, and by the late 1940s, the border between the two islands was redubbed the Ice Curtain. Before the Cold War, both Diomede Islands were populated by the same tribe of Inupiaq people. The border existed for over a century before the formation of the Ice Curtain, when America bought the Alaskan territory from Russia in 1867. Even so, the people of Diomede were able to cross freely from one island to the other. Surrounded by ice, harsh seas, and heavy fog, the small islands are flat-topped and rocky. On the western shore of Little Diomede is the village of Diomede. The village is so nice they named it twice. While it's certainly not overrun by development, Diomede also should not be confused with a lush tropical paradise. The natural world of the island is extremely sparse. In fact, most of the Diomede landmass is made of large rocks of granite and quartz. No trees or shrubs grow anywhere on the island, but there are a handful of grasses and plants that emerge during the summertime. Beach cabbage, potatoes, and seaweed are also commonly harvested for food, but that's pretty much it. And it's unlikely that Instacart delivers out there. For a few dozen of the Alaskan Inupiaq natives that live there, it is actually possible to see Russia from their house. Not that there's much to see. In 1948, the border was abruptly closed due to escalating tensions between the United States and Russia. The inhabitants of Big Diomede were forcibly relocated to Chukotka Okrug on the Russian mainland, and the island was reconfigured into a military base. Though the Cold War is technically long over, Russia is still going to be Russia. Big Diomede remains occupied by Russian forces, and many of the resettled residents of Diomede still remain in the eastern Siberian peninsula of Russia. And Russian observation posts on Big Diomede are still in operation, monitoring the people of Little Diomede. While the two islands are only a little over 2 miles apart, the Russian-American border isn't the only thing that lies between them. In fact, the international dateline also lies in the narrow passage between the two islands, putting Big Diomede almost entirely a day ahead of its American counterpart, without the need for any time-traveling DeLoreans. Because of this geographical quirk, the islands are colloquially called Yesterday and Tomorrow Island, like different sections of Disneyland. Tactically speaking, the islands are actually 20 to 21 hours apart, depending on the time of year, which presumably makes any interactions between the two kind of confusing. According to the 2010 census, the town of Diomede has a population of approximately 110 people, but more recent sources suggest the population has dwindled as low as 80, which is still enough to field a few volleyball teams, in case the weather ever clears up. The Inupiaq people indigenous to the Diomede Islands live on a subsistence diet primarily consisting of seal, walrus, polar bear, whale, and crab. In addition to being a primary means of gathering food, hunting is also an important social ritual. Some modern adjustments have been made, such as home electricity and limited Wi-Fi connection, presumably so the Inupiaq can stay caught up on succession. But for the most part, Diomede residents still generally adhere to their traditional lifestyle, drying hides and living off the land. There has also recently been a push to preserve the Inupiaq language, which is undocumented and only spoken by 8 to 10 elders. Theoretically, Diomede residents are able to travel freely from America to Russia without a visa permit, but in reality, such expeditions have been few and far between. Though it is no longer enacted by law, the strength of the ice curtain that separates the two islands still exists. There is no direct air or boat service from one side of the Bering Strait to the other. That means to get from Diomede to the nearest Russian port, one must take an expensive trip to the Alaskan mainland before flying to the Diomede Islands and then to the Russian mainland. After arranging for that very expensive air travel, one must then secure a formal invitation for the community that they would like to visit. Given the extreme isolation of life in the Diomedes, getting that invite is no small task. In other words, pop-ups are all but impossible. You have to call ahead, way, way ahead. When it comes to climate change, the Arctic Circle is the proverbial canary in the coal mine, and its effects are hitting Diomede hard. After millennia of a reliable Arctic climate with cool summers, the temperatures have risen considerably in just 50 years. One Diomede resident, Edward Suluk, even joked that soon the population of the island will have to start growing palm trees. He is kidding, but that would look kind of nice. The truth for the residents of Diomede is that their subsistence lifestyle requires a stable ecosystem. And due to rising temperatures, their food security has taken an appreciable hit. For example, there are fewer walruses and seals with each passing year, jeopardizing a crucial element of the Diomede diet. Supplies brought in by delivery jets would land on an ice runway, which is pretty awesome. But because of the rapid temperature change, the runway is now too thin to safely support regular flights, so the resource deliveries have been downsized to a helicopter. Compensating for the loss of airplane service means those deliveries must now come from a variety of other vessels. Helicopters, for example, deliver mail weekly, and ski planes carrying supplies can sometimes manage to land during the winter. While this system keeps the supplies flowing for the island's population, it has reduced the amount of resources that can be brought in any one trip, and is far less efficient. So delivery ski jets, while bodacious, would probably not do much to help the situation. The permafrost is also melting, and the town is slowly beginning to shift down the coast, as much as 2 to 6 centimeters a year. And as the surrounding ice begins to melt, Diomede becomes more vulnerable to storms. Long story short, the situation does not look good. While a subsistence diet is part of the cultural heritage of Diomede, it is also a necessity given the higher prices they pay on imported foods. Due to the high cost of shipping and importation, food and other household supplies are just too expensive for most Diomede residents to afford. According to a 2018 article in National Geographic, a bag of sea salt cost $32.59 on Diomede, and a bottle of Tide laundry detergent cost $44.15. You know what? I'll just do my laundry in the sea. And if you're thinking about shopping around to see what the competition is charging, forget it, because there is no competition. There is only one store that sells groceries in Diomede, so there is no system for competitive pricing. While alcoholism is not a major problem for the residents of Diomede, they are not taking any chances. In fact, alcohol has been outright banned in the village. Which makes sense. It would be way too easy to just get hammered all day in a remote island community where the mail comes once a week. Diomede is a completely dry village. The importation and sale of alcohol are strictly forbidden on the island. Those who violate the alcohol ban are given a fine, which, considering the high unemployment rate, is presumably a strong deterrent. So far, the banning of booze hasn't drawn any bootlegger gangs to Diomede, which is a testament to the extreme conditions. It's so harsh up there, not even mobsters can turn a profit. The unemployment rate in Diomede is very high. By some estimates, around 40% of residents were jobless in 2011. Most of those who are employed have multiple jobs, often several part-time gigs including hunting, fishing, ivory carving, and sewing, either in addition to or in lieu of full-time employment. City infrastructure management, gas, electric, and construction, is the largest employer in Diomede, followed by the school, clinic, and general store. Finding work for people can be something of a challenge in the small, isolated village. During summertime, there are limited tourism opportunities, and due to the low population and overall lack of retail options, there are rarely new positions available. Apparently, that single grocery store isn't hiring. Speaking of which, it's difficult to live a modern life in a place as remote as Diomede. The pressures of modernization are a major challenge facing the future of Diomede, especially when it comes to the younger generation. Although Diomede traditions are still practiced, kids who grow up on Diomede are not entirely isolated from modern fixtures like video games and the internet. Their access is limited, but exposure to the outside world has made these kids aware of their isolation. Some believe this has made it increasingly likely that the younger generation will eventually leave the island. When asked about the looming threat of relocation, tribal leader Robert Suluk was realistic but hopeful, telling National Geographic, "I'm sure they would vote to move, but like all animals or any human who lives on Earth, we are adaptable." tales of the 20th century Russian mystic Grigory Rasputin have captured the world's collective imagination since his death in 1916. Professing mystical healing powers and the ability to predict the future, Rasputin gained a staggering amount of influence in late imperial Russia. But it's difficult to separate fact from fiction when discussing his unusual life. So, today we're talking about the enduring mystery of Grigory Rasputin, Russia's infamous Mad Monk. Okay, let's settle in with our cartoon bat sidekick and conjure some weird history. Born Grigory Yefimovich Naivik, Rasputin's early life is a bit of a mystery. Religion captured his interest, and he briefly studied to become a monk. After a short stint at the Verkhovnoye monastery, he abandoned this pursuit to wander. This became something of a pattern for him, like a 9-year-old who keeps switching sports. Just pick a hobby, Grigory. He found himself in the city of Abalek, where he met his wife, Praskovya Fyodorovna, at age 19. The family life didn't hold Rasputin's attention for long, and he left to make a holy pilgrimage in 1897. In other words, he went out for a pack of cigarettes at the end of the 19th century and never came back. Rasputin trekked from the small Siberian village of Pokrovsk to Greece and the Middle East. He gained a reputation as a holy man in the Russian city of Kazan. Although he had no ties to a church, his charisma and reputation as a mystic helped him build a following. According to the Encyclopedia Britannica, he met the monks of the Huisti order while visiting the Verkhovnoye monastery. Rumors about their activities were genuinely strange, including supposed orgies and self-flagellation. Although he chose not to join their order, he adopted a version of the beliefs of the Huisti monks that held one was nearest God when feeling holy passionlessness. Rasputin interpreted this to mean that true holiness could only be obtained through wild debauchery. If you have to interpret your path to true holiness, wild debauchery is not a bad way to go. His behavior and attitudes even earned him his surname. Rasputin roughly translates to debauched one. Eventually, his wanderings brought him to St. Petersburg, where he made a name for himself as a self-styled mystic with magnificent healing powers. Tsarevich Alexei Nikolaevich, the young son of Emperor Nicholas II and Empress Alexandra, struggled with hemophilia, also known as the dice royalty rolls every time they have kids with their immediate family. Doctors weren't having much luck treating Alexei, so the royal family turned to Rasputin for help. In 1908, Nicholas and Alexandra brought Rasputin to court. Then something unexpected happened. Rasputin's mere presence seemed to help Alexei. Whenever the holy man was around, the boy's suffering and pain seemed less severe. Historians aren't sure why, but aspirin could be one explanation. At the time, aspirin was a cure-all drug, so the doctors visiting Alexei often gave it to him. But aspirin is also a blood thinner. In other words, not the best treatment for someone with a disorder that prevents his blood from clotting. Keeping the doctors away and thus preventing more doses of aspirin might have had the appearance of helping. And it's also possible Alexei may have just been soothed by Rasputin's presence. After all, the guy had a reputation for being a magical healer, and he had a pretty sweet beard to back that story up. Alexandra, who obsessed over Alexei's health and was attracted to mysticism and spiritualism, quickly became Rasputin's biggest fan. Wowing the Empress is a pretty solid move when you're trying to get your foot in the palace door. Unfortunately, Alexandra wasn't exactly popular with the Russian people, who distrusted her German heritage and didn't approve of her closeness to Rasputin. Rumors of an affair between the Empress and the mystical madman began swirling. Whether or not they were actually knocking the old-timey boots is unknown, although historians like Douglas Smith have concluded the rumors were false. Even so, Rasputin was shockingly popular with the ladies. I'm telling you, it's the beard. He amassed a large female following early on, like an entire K-pop band trapped in Dumbledore's body. He used his Lothario persona to his advantage, seizing the opportunity to promote himself and add to his own mystique. Many women found themselves attracted to his unkempt appearance, finding it authentic. It's kind of like that guy who shows up at your house party, wearing homemade clothes and in one hand a six-pack of kombucha and the other an acoustic guitar. He's just so real. Yeah, a real jerk. Rasputin also spent considerable time visiting brothels and had many admirers. Historian Abraham Asher even notes, some men actually felt honored to be cuckolded by the lascivious monk. Apparently, the Mad Monk inadvertently discovered a genre of adult film. Well, I guess he did claim to be able to see the future. The point is, Rasputin's sheer presence brought women to his side, despite his somewhat dubious hygiene. Oh yeah, the Mad Monk was the very picture of a sloppy jerk. He often wore dirty clothes to meetings with the imperial family and boasted about wearing the same pair of underwear for 6 months on at least one occasion. But Rasputin's legendary hygiene problems did not stop at his dirty laundry. They extended to the dinner table, too. Rasputin often had bits of food stuck in his beard. He also had a habit of licking serving spoons before they were used to serve others. And he didn't care much for silverware either, opting to rip his food apart with his hands. He lived like an actual bridge troll. Yet he still managed to acquire vast influence in the royal court. Mystical powers or not, Rasputin's work with Alexei Romanov put him in a powerful position in the Russian royal court. Nicholas and Alexandra loved Rasputin and dismissed any allegations about his strange behavior. Ingratiating himself to the two grateful parents led to the mystic gaining some political influence. Prince Felix Yusupov, more on him in a moment, claimed in his memoirs that Rasputin used his influence to take control of Russia's military. Propaganda posters from the time depicted Rasputin as a nefarious puppet master controlling Nicholas and Alexandra. Consequently, critics blamed Rasputin for Russia's ruinous involvement in World War I, regardless of how much he may have actually been involved in the decision-making. Disdain for Rasputin steadily grew from a small number of critics to a large number of outright haters, and their animosity wasn't confined to the realm of disparaging memes and YouTube comments. The growing hostility against the mystic led to several assassination plots. An excommunicated monk named Iliodor tried to hire sex workers to take out Rasputin, but Rasputin discovered the plot, causing Iliodor to abandon his plan. Hey, Iliodor, that's not the service you hire prostitutes for. One of Iliodor's followers was a bit more successful. Kyonya Gusava, disgusted by the sordid tales of Rasputin's deeds, believed him to be the literal Antichrist. Maybe she saw him eat. So in June of 1914, she stabbed Rasputin. He survived that attempt on his life, but 2 years later, he wouldn't be so lucky. On the night of December 29, 1916, a group of noblemen, including Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich and Prince Felix Yusupov, hatched a plot to bring down Rasputin. The precise events are mainly unknown. Some accounts, primarily those of Prince Yusupov, tell a colorful story. It begins with nobles luring Rasputin to a palace with the promise of women, food, and booze. Rasputin, being a pretty big fan of all three things, showed up ready to party and proceeded to down several rounds of cyanide-laced cakes and poisoned wine. Presumably growing rather alarmed that the poison wasn't working, Yusupov shot him. Maybe open with the shooting next time, fellas. Rasputin survived the first gunshot and fled to the courtyard, where Yusupov shot him a second time, at which point Rasputin collapsed. Afterward, the noblemen reportedly bludgeoned him, wrapped his body in a blanket, and threw him in the Neva River. Things got even weirder from there. Rasputin was initially buried at Tsarsky Selo, but on March 11, 1917, Rasputin's body was dug up and burned. According to one account, once it became engulfed in flames, the body sat up as if Rasputin were rising one last time. The most infamous rumor following his death is that assassins cut off his member thing. Over the years, several people have claimed to have possession of it, but the truth is, Rasputin's official autopsy report showed his body to be intact upon his death. In fact, the autopsy pretty much deflates the entire story of Rasputin's demise. For instance, Yusupov claimed Rasputin was still alive when he was thrown in the river, but there were no signs of water in his lungs, meaning he had most likely already expired. The autopsy also didn't show any poison in his system, concluding that Rasputin had died from a bullet wound to the head. Because of these little inconsistencies, historians agree that Yusupov was probably full of shit, but the world will never know for sure. Rasputin's official autopsy report disappeared during Stalin's regime 20 years later. And despite the evidence against Yusupov's story, his account prevails throughout pop culture. Healing wasn't the only trick Rasputin had up his sleeve. He also claimed to be able to predict the future. In 1912, he wrote a book detailing some of his prophecies, called Pious Reflections. A few of his predictions did not come to pass, like his prediction the world would end in August of 2013. That's the same month and year Ashton Kutcher's Steve Jobs movie was released, so we'll give him partial credit. However, some of his other prophecies did have some legs, including his firm belief that the Romanovs would be killed in a revolution. In a letter from late 1916, he wrote to Nicholas, "I feel that I should leave before January 1st. If it was your relations who had wrought my death, then no one in the family. That is to say, none of your children or relations will remain alive for more than 2 years. They will be killed by the Russian people." Rasputin felt so strongly about this hunch, he also mentioned it in his book of prophecies. And in July 1918, Nicholas, Alexandra, and their 5 beloved children were killed by a group of Bolsheviks in a small basement during the Russian Revolution. Not gonna lie, that's a little eerie. The silver screen has been fascinated with Rasputin for a long time. He appears as an evil sorcerer in Anastasia and as a member of a secret evil organization in the 2021 film The Kingsman. But the strangest intersection of cinema and the Mad Monk comes at the end of every movie's credits. You know that disclaimer you see at the end of the movies that reads, "This is a work of fiction. Any similarity to actual persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental?" According to a 2016 Slate feature, the 1937 film Rasputin and the Empress is the reason for that disclaimer's existence. A fictional character from the film was based on Prince Yusupov's wife, Irina. Irina figured it out and sued the filmmakers for libel. Incidentally, Yusupov himself appeared in the 1967 film I Killed Rasputin. That's a pretty straightforward title. Did Rasputin truly have mystical healing abilities and the power to see the future? Or was he simply a charismatic grifter with a carefully constructed image? While science and magicians have concluded that magic isn't real, it's hard to say exactly what Rasputin's deal was. So much of his life and legacy has been obscured, embellished, or outright lost. But his story is compelling, and the enduring mystery of Rasputin will undoubtedly live in our collective minds for a long time to come. The Russian Revolution resulted in the establishment of the first communist state in history, and was the work of Vladimir Lenin and Joseph Stalin, or at least that's the story you've read in textbooks. But in truth, that's an incredibly simplified version of the events that took place between 1905 and 1925 in Russia. So, today we're going to take a look at some fascinating little-known facts about the Russian Revolution. Okay, you say you want a revolution. Well, here we go. Technically, the Russian Revolution was actually 3 events. There was an uprising in 1905 that set the stage for the 2 uprisings that occurred in 1917. The Revolution of 1905, also called the First Russian Revolution, was the result of widespread discontent among the peasantry and workers in Russia. Directed against the Tsarist government of Nicholas II, the 1905 revolution included notable events like the Bloody Sunday Massacre, which, for the record, is not the same Bloody Sunday as the U2 song. Apparently, Sunday is just a popular day for state violence. On this Bloody Sunday, hundreds of people were left injured and slain after Russian troops crushed a demonstration by factory workers in St. Petersburg. In response to the revolution, Tsar Nicholas II issued the October Manifesto, which reformed the government, established representative bodies called Duma, and saw to the development of a constitution. But the Duma failed to get any cohesive reforms passed, and the additional strain of World War I led to even more upheaval in the country. By February of 1917, a revolution broke out in Petrograd, with thousands of demonstrators protesting and rioting. As a result, Tsar Nicholas abdicated and took his son out of the line of succession, leaving his brother, Michael, as the next ruler. Michael ultimately refused to take the throne, probably a smart move, and the Russian Provisional Government was established. But this governing body only lasted a few months. Never able to stabilize or wield any effective power, the Russian Provisional Government kept Russia in World War I and was fairly hands-off, which led to continued shortages and violence. It was against this government that Vladimir Lenin launched a coup d'etat in October and established a communist Russia. Or it might have been November, depending on your calendar. Yeah, about that. The events of 1917 and how they shaped Russian history are a bit muddied by the fact that the Soviet Union didn't adopt the Gregorian calendar until 1918. The calendar, named after Pope Gregory XIII, was slightly shorter than the Julian calendar. In 1917, Russia still used the Julian calendar, even though it had been long since abandoned by much of the Western world. According to the Julian calendar, the uprisings in Russia took place on February 23rd, October 24th, and October 25th of 1917. But on the Gregorian calendar, those dates were March 17th, November 6th, and November 7th. When Russia finally switched to the Gregorian calendar in 1918, it eliminated 13 days from its calendar, which now makes it pretty confusing to identify the dates of those historical events. And you thought daylight savings time was a pain in the ass. During the Russian Civil War, the United States sent roughly 5,000 troops to North Russia to fight at the request of British and French troops in the region. The group landed in Arkhangelsk, Russia in late 1918, just as World War I was coming to an end. Largely comprising men from Michigan and Wisconsin, shout out to the Midwest, the Army Expedition Force was tasked with keeping weapons out of German and Bolshevik hands, as well as assisting a group of Czechoslovakian forces stranded in Russia. Through the winter of 1918 and 1919, the Polar Bears, as they became known, focused their efforts on 6 specific locations throughout the province as temperatures reached below -50 degrees Fahrenheit. Amid the cold, American forces found that their weapons froze to the point of being unusable. According to Harry J. Costello, one of the men who served, the problem was eventually solved by an American machine gunner who suggested putting hot water in the jacket, wrapping the gun in several heavy blankets, and changing the water frequently when freezing was near. This method didn't work everywhere, however. On fronts where it was next to impossible to build a fire, the water-cooled machine guns were useless. It's a shame there weren't any hollowed-out tauntauns nearby. Born in what is now Ukraine, Osip Bernstein studied law in Germany and went on to become a finance lawyer. During the Bolshevik Revolution, he was arrested by the Cheka, or Bolshevik secret police, for counter-revolutionary crimes. After being taken into custody, Bernstein received a death sentence for working with banks in pre-Bolshevik Russia. On his execution day, he was lined up in front of a firing squad when one of the commanders asked what his name was. Upon hearing the man's name, the commander realized Bernstein wasn't just some lawyer, but he was also one of the most talented chess players in Russia. It sounds like a twist from a Hollywood movie, but the commanding officer challenged him to a chess match. If Bernstein won, he would be allowed to live. If he lost, well, you know. Bernstein accepted the challenge and won. He was spared, freed, and later settled in France, where he presumably told everyone his name all of the time. By late 1917, the Provisional Government of Russia was failing. The Winter Palace in Petrograd was the seat of government, which made it a prime target of militant Bolsheviks. The head of the Russian Provisional Government, Alexander Kerensky, naturally ordered its defense. Reportedly, 137 members of the Women's Battalion of Death, which kind of sounds like an esports team, stood alongside Cossack and Russian troops to resist the Bolsheviks. But it didn't go well. According to David Soskis's first-hand account of the event, the palace was pillaged and devastated from top to bottom by the Bolshevik armed mob, as though by a horde of barbarians. Among the palace's target areas was an extensive wine cellar. When bottles were smashed and crates of wine were thrown into holes in the river ice, crazed people dove in after and drowned. Reports also surfaced that officials tried to pump wine out into the streets, but crowds gathered to drink it from the gutter. Hey, it was a good vintage. Still another reporter recalled thinking she heard gunfire, but it was actually the pop of corks by soldiers who lay on the white snow, not dead, but merely drunk. It was not common for revolutionaries to change their names, but both Vladimir Lenin and Joseph Stalin gave their personal monikers a bit of a punch-up. They were nothing if not PR-minded. In 1901, Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov adopted the surname Lenin while in exile. The pseudonym was to protect his true identity. But why did he choose the name Lenin? After all, Beatlemania was still a good 60 years in the future. Observers, including Lenin's own niece, Olga Ulyanova, theorize it may have been in reference to the Lena River. Other possibilities include being an homage to a character in Leo Tolstoy's novel, Kazaki, or it may have belonged to a dead man whose name Lenin simply usurped, sort of like 50 Cent. The man the world knows as Joseph Stalin was born Joseph Vissarionovich Jugasvili. In 1912, however, he changed his name to a Russian word that essentially means man of steel. This was 26 years before Action Comics #1, which makes Stalin the original Man of Steel. Historian Vilhelm Pokiblim believes Stalin's name change was driven by the fact that the surname was simple, devoid of all artistic pretense, understood by any worker, and, most importantly, looked like a real last name. Also, Stalin sounds cool. You cannot underestimate the importance of a cool-sounding name. Speaking of names, when communists took over in 1917, the practice of Octobering was established to unite the populace through rituals and ceremonies. One way this manifested was to give babies names inspired by the changing culture. Names like Elektrifikatsa, meaning electrification, Karm, meaning Red Army, and Ninel, which is Lenin spelled backwards, became popular. Other October names include Melor, an anagram derived from the words Marx, Engels, Lenin, October Revolution, and Komintern, a portmanteau of Communist International. At least Khaleesi didn't make the list. More Game of Thrones references. Will it ever die? And it wasn't just personal names that were affected. St. Petersburg was named Petrograd in 1914 because it sounded too German, though it was then changed to Leningrad in 1924, shortly after Lenin's passing. However, in 1991, a referendum was passed changing the name of the city back to St. Petersburg. The war between Vladimir Lenin's Bolshevik Red Army was composed of members of the Red Guard, elite troops in Imperial Russia, and personnel from the Imperial Army. The Red Army seemed to be at a disadvantage, with support sent to Russia by the US, Japan, the UK, and other countries around the world. However, conscription, recruitment, and mass mobilization allowed the Bolsheviks to grow the Red Army's ranks to overwhelming numbers. Too overwhelming, it turns out, even for Lenin. Desertion, a lack of supplies, and poor training resulted in Lenin issuing a December 1919 memo that suggested it is 1,000 times more expedient to have no more than 1 million Red Army men in all, but well-fed, clothed, and shod ones, rather than 3 million half-starved, half-naked, half-shod ones. And while we understand his point, a Bolshevik army of shirtless soldiers hopping around in one boot would have been no less historic. After Tsar Nicholas II abdicated in March of 1917, he, his wife Alexandra, and their 5 children were kept in confinement at Yekaterinburg in the Ural Mountains. In July of 1918, when it looked like there might be an effort to rescue the Romanovs, the whole family was whacked. In addition to Nicholas and his children, numerous members of the extended Romanov family were done away with. According to Time magazine, all these people were taken to an abandoned mine and thrown down a shaft. Hand grenades were then dropped in after them to eliminate any uncertainty. Damn, how would you even categorize that? Execution by action movie? Lenin was exiled in 1895 and lived in Siberia for 3 years. Once that period ended, he went to London, where he published a pamphlet about making Russia a socialist country entitled What is to be Done. He would not be the last person to write the equivalent of an indignant blog post after being thrown out of a place. Lenin returned to Russia in 1905. By that time, the Russian order was restored, and the promises made by Tsar Nicholas II's October Manifesto had come to fruition. Russia had a constitution, and there was a national parliament, and so Lenin was once again exiled in 1907. In April of 1917, Lenin headed back to Russia with dozens of other exiles, riding a train from Zurich through Germany, then up to the Baltic Sea. From there, the group took a ferry and boarded another train to Sweden. The landscape proved to be challenging for Lenin and his fellow revolutionaries. They had to use horse-drawn sleds to cross a frozen river into Finland, but they made it. And Lenin took a train to Petrograd soon after. Keeping Lenin out of Russia was apparently like trying to ban Garfield from the Olive Garden. They do have similar whiskers. After World War II, Soviet Russia and the whole of the Soviet Union found itself under the authoritarian rule of Joseph Stalin. As the Cold War progressed, leaders such as Nikita Khrushchev and Mikhail Gorbachev brought changes to the communist stronghold, but finding enough to eat remained a problem for millions. To survive, people had to get innovative in the kitchen. This often meant resorting to unconventional foods that reflected the multiculturalism of the Soviet Union, or just making do with whatever happened to be available. Today, we're going to take a look at some unconventional foods people ate to survive in Soviet Russia. Okay, so let's find out what they ate back in the US, back in the US, back in the URSSR. Shirniki, or cheese pancakes, were made from tvorog, or dry curd cheese, and they were a staple for breakfast in the Soviet Union. Often cooks added fresh or dried fruit to the pancake or included some compote. Once a mixture of cheese, eggs, flour, and other items to taste was ready, it was poured into a buttered skillet and cooked until brown on one side. It was then flipped and browned on the other. Shironiki could then be served with more fruit or with sour cream. The term kotlete once referred to cutlets of meat, but over time, the dish evolved. By the Soviet era, the term came to refer to a meal that fell somewhere between a meatball and a hamburger. Kotlete typically includes minced meat mixed with vegetables like cabbage, carrots, and beets. This mixture may or may not be breaded, but is always fried. Thought to have been invented during the 1800s, chicken Kiev has long been considered a delicacy, even during the Soviet period. The dish featured chicken fillets with a bone sticking out of the side. The meat was filled with a butter of sorts and came to be served at restaurants throughout major cities in Russia. It later found global attention, especially popular among tourists as they were introduced to Russian cuisine at tourist restaurants, which were sponsored by the official tourist agency of the Soviet Union. The dish, however, is not without its controversy. Both Russians and Ukrainians claim ownership of chicken Kiev, something that found new attention when George H.W. Bush gave his so-called Chicken Kiev speech in 1991. The talk was written by future Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice and delivered from Kiev, which was part of the Soviet Union at the time. Long story short, it seemed to indicate Bush and the United States did not support Ukrainian independence as the breakup of the Soviet Union loomed, a position that wasn't terribly popular with Ukrainians or Bush's conservative allies back in America. Perhaps the most identifiable Russian meal, borscht, was generally made up of broth, beets, and cabbage, with countless other additives. These included, but were not limited to, things like potatoes, beans, eggs, vegetables, and cream. The dish was then served chilled or piping hot, depending on the season and preference of whoever was eating it. Borscht also took on regional differences. In some regions, like Romania, fruit was often added, and seasonal availability of foods also dictated what was thrown into the mix. As a meal consumed by poor Russians long before the rise of the Soviet Union, borscht was touted as a healthy, relatively easy, and delicious meal by military men, Soviet premiers, and cosmonauts alike. Borscht even appears in historical events, like the mutiny on the battleship Potemkin, and in literary works like The Master and Margarita by Mikhail Bulgakov. During the Cold War, recipes for borscht remained well guarded. After all, one can't have their recipes for dinner falling into enemy hands. When it was finally released by the CIA, a traditional borscht recipe from 1948 revealed how beets, fat, bouillon, tomato paste, and vinegar were combined in a closed pot before adding flour, laurel leaves, and seasoning. With cabbage and potatoes incorporated into the mix, borscht was served after subsequent stewing. It could also include sauerkraut, beet leaves, and millet. It really just depended on what a cook had on hand. Drawing from both the French vinaigrette tradition and the Russian practice of finely chopping vegetables, vinaigrette was a term applied to, well, just that, vegetables chopped up and covered in an oil-based dressing. Some featured meat, but during the Soviet era, it was more common to have cabbage, beets, and pickles covered in sunflower oil. To make them soft and tender, the vegetable ingredients were boiled prior to being chopped up. Vinaigrette was then typically served as an evening meal, presented alongside meat, bread, and soup. In the Soviet Union, meat was a luxury. Thus, the best cuts of beef did not appear on average dinner tables. Restaurants also struggled to provide quality meat options, so in order to make cheaper cuts palatable, many coated meat in breadcrumbs, cooked it for long periods of time, or supplemented it with more common items like onions. That said, many state-owned restaurants did their best to offer good cuts of meat, punishing managers and food distributors who misrepresented or cheated customers. They took this very seriously. In fact, one Polish meat distributor, Stanisław Wawrecki, was literally killed for meat distribution fraud in 1965. Steak in the Soviet Union was different than in the United States. When Duke Ellington visited the Soviet Union while on tour during the early 1970s, he demanded steaks, which were a staple of his diet alongside Coca-Cola, sugar, and limes. Ellington was told by the State Department that steak would not taste like steak in the United States and couldn't guarantee he'd be satisfied with food in the Soviet Union. Ellington was ultimately unable to eat Russian steaks, and when U.S. state officials later heard Ellington was losing weight while on tour, they had a dozen T-bone steaks flown to Minsk for the musician. Why the U.S. State Department was so concerned about Ellington's diet is anybody's guess. Soups were common features on Russian tables, especially since they were made of whatever was on hand. One such soup was rasolnik. It may have once been called kalia at one point in history when it was a thicker stew-like meal that included caviar, chicken, and even kidneys. However, modern rasolnik, which is still popular in Ukraine and Belarus, among other places, is made of beef, barley, and pickles. Caviar was readily available before 1917, but after revolution struck and austerity set in, it quickly became one of the items only the elite could get their hands on. Caviar was often eaten on a pancake or blini, made of flour, buckwheat, eggs, milk, and water. That being said, blinis weren't always eaten with caviar. They could also be topped with jelly or butter. Fish, whether it was pickled, smoked, or salted, is often commonly eaten on blinis. Traditionally, the more luxurious your toppings, the smaller the cake. The caviar in Soviet Russia was most commonly of the black variety, usually from sturgeon, and over time it became permanently associated with luxury and wealth, especially in locations outside of the Soviet Union. In 1980, for example, a caviar smuggling ring was investigated after several cans of the foodstuffs were sent out of the Soviet Union labeled as herring. The suspects were allegedly even found with gold, silver, and jewels unimaginable in the Soviet Union after selling the caviar in Europe. Mayonnaise was super popular in the Soviet Union because it was readily available and blended with pretty much everything, including meat and potatoes in the dish salat olivia. Mayonnaise was relatively easy to make, politically endorsed, and had longevity on shelves. These qualities made it an ideal and incredibly useful kitchen staple. When cooks were left with an array of ingredients, mayonnaise was used to fuse it all together. In addition to salat olivia, mayonnaise was found in a dish called herring under a fur coat, which we assume tastes better than it sounds. The meal included pickled, or sometimes salted, herring topped with onions, beets, carrots, and other vegetables, with mayonnaise squeezed in between layers. But that's not all they did with mayonnaise. It was also used in soup, in cake, and on liver, attesting to the egg product's versatility. Okroshka was a cold soup made from a mix of meat, vegetables, and kvass. Okroshka usually also included radishes and cucumbers and was cooked for such long periods of time that it was difficult to tell the quality of ingredients. When food was scarce, okroshka usually included whatever could be found. Instead of quality meat, scraps were thrown in, but by the end of the 1950s, sausage and frankfurters were used. In particularly trying times, okroshka lacked meat of any kind. Okroshka was served cold, and over time, cooks began to substitute kvass with kefir. In addition to these two versions of okroshka, the cold soup may have even included vodka. When in Russia, during World War II, eggs were not a common commodity in the Soviet Union, and the population had to settle for powdered eggs instead. This lasted through the mid-1950s when eggs began to re-emerge in the market. But to try to sell people on the powdered variety, Soviet propaganda smeared real eggs to such an extent that people were hesitant to eat them. Eventually, a campaign to repair the healthy, desirable status of the egg in Soviet Russia succeeded, and people began to eat them again. Eggs were eaten in numerous forms and included in all kinds of dishes. Eggs were commonly consumed with meat, vegetables, and fruit, including pickled and jammed options. Buckwheat was a common feature in Soviet cuisine, appearing in everything from blinis to stuffing. It could be mixed with milk, eggs, cheese, or fruit as a porridge, or with vegetables and other grains for a more savory dish. However, when Russian Premier Nikita Khrushchev was presented with a suckling pig stuffed with buckwheat on an official visit to Bulgaria in 1962, he was not pleased. Why not? Well, suckling pig was a delicacy and one that sent a clear message of celebration and excess. The presentation of such a lavish display angered Khrushchev and prompted him to chide the Russian ambassador. Do you think communism has already arrived? Who gave the order for this? The ambassador, who we assumed wanted to disappear, explained that extra funds had been allocated for Khrushchev's visit, but it was not common fare. Despite his initial anger, Khrushchev reportedly ate the meal. Aspics, or meat jellies, were made from boiling meat stock, cooling it, and mixing in ingredients such as roasted meat and fish. Also known as koledjets and galantine, aspic was served cold at celebratory feasts and holiday meals. The fundamental ingredients remained consistent, with meat products serving at its base, but the quality of that material varied. According to accounts from Leningrad in 1941 and 1942, aspic was made from leather belts and wood glue. Products also derived from animal byproducts. According to Anna Astroumova-Lebedeva's diary entry from January 1, 1942, they ate wood glue, but the aspic was not so disgusting if you added cinnamon or a few bay leaves. And if you think that sounds horrible, hold on to your hat, because there were even reports that human remains were used to make aspic. One Soviet officer who deserted in 1942 told German radio Leningrad was on its last legs, adding, "Putrefied corpses are now its main source of food. The remaining inhabitants eat meat aspic made out of glue and human flesh." Though it was years in the making, the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 occurred rather suddenly, and in its immediate aftermath, the Russian people hoped for freedom. Sadly, their hopes were not fulfilled. So, today we're going to take a look at what really happened right after the collapse of the USSR. Time for a story of crime and punishment, war and peace, and probably some other really long books by Dostoevsky. If one thing symbolized Western freedom more than anything else in Russian eyes, it was a pair of blue jeans, and it is difficult to argue with that definition. Jeans may have been ordinary for Americans, but to Russians, they were a glimpse into a world beyond the Iron Curtain. A genuine pair of Levi's would command a huge price in the Soviet Union, where there was a vibrant underground market in counterfeit denim. The black market always had your back, or your buns in this case. Even Russian propaganda pieces highlighting the dire poverty in American inner cities couldn't hide the fact that even the poorest Americans could still afford a pair of jeans that a Russian engineer would have to forsake a month's salary for, which had to sting. So, when the Soviet Union collapsed, ordinary Russian people yearned for a flood of real denim and other Western goods, and the freedom they promised. But as is usually the case, the reality wasn't nearly as good as the dream. The luxuries of the West were slow to come, stores emptied, and millions were plunged into dire poverty. The Russian mafia has a long history that stretches back to the days of the Czar and several James Bond movies. Under Mikhail Gorbachev in the late 1980s, around 800 criminal gangs operated in Russia. They mostly dealt in the black market, bringing in Western contraband, like those coveted blue jeans, but otherwise kept a fairly low profile. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the number of gangs exploded tenfold by the mid-1990s. The mafia eagerly filled the power vacuum the fall of communism created. The ranks of criminal gangs swelled, with ex-KGB agents and military veterans returning from Afghanistan. There was a surplus of skilled muscle with no other options. Or in other words, violence had never been cheaper. A hit in the 90s could be carried out for as little as $1,000 American, roughly the cost of a plane ticket to Disneyland. And at that price, who could afford not to have your enemy killed? Wonder if they had bulk rates, or maybe a kind of fast pass. Predictably, the cemeteries began to fill with the graves of slain mob bosses. Also, the lifting of certain restrictions allowed ordinary Russians to open their own businesses, which in turn gave the syndicate a steady stream of protection money. More businesses means more people to shake down. The government estimated that in 1994, about 40% of private businesses and 60% of state businesses were controlled by the mafia. The vast majority of banks were also under criminal control, although that probably didn't affect the general public as much. I mean, is there really a difference between Wells Fargo and Dmitry No-Nose Popovich? Think about it. At the lowest levels of society, young gopniks picked clean the pockets of passerbys. At the upper levels, unscrupulous officials attempted to profit from the sale of Soviet hardware to anyone willing to buy it. There was even an infamous attempt to sell a submarine to the Colombian cartel. It was a tough time for everyone, except for criminals and Hollywood screenwriters. In fairness, that submarine deal would make a pretty rad movie. The collapse of the USSR brought about one of the fastest transfers of wealth in human history, at least until Jeff Bezos invented a bookstore, but online. At the time, the vast reserves of petroleum, natural gas, and metal deposits were ripe for plunder, and a tiny number of Russians were well poised to take full advantage of the situation. The transfer of state assets into private hands for a pittance was supposed to make their operation more efficient and prevent a reversion to communism. While that might have worked, it effectively just wound up trading communist oligarchs for business oligarchs. In fact, 3 distinct groups of oligarchs rose. The first was the factory directors, who used their position to assume ownership of the facilities they once ran. The other 2 groups, by far the biggest profiteers, were known as the nomenklatura and the non-nomenklatura oligarchs. Gonna need a cheat sheet for all these oligarchs. The nomenklatura were ex-Soviet elites who assumed control of the assets they once managed in the USSR. For example, Viktor Chernomyrdin went from the minister of gas production to the head of the world's largest natural gas company, presumably adding several more garages to his mansion in the process. The non-nomenklatura oligarchs were outside of the traditional circles of power in the USSR, but had black market experience and, crucially, the means to raise large amounts of capital as bank owners to take full advantage of the fire sale. These guys funded the ailing Russian government in exchange for temporary stakes in state assets. Should the government default on those loans, those temporary shares would become permanent, which of course is exactly what happened. What was supposed to kickstart the new market economy only served to enrich a small number of Russians, while sharply contracting the economy at large. Russia went from having not a single millionaire in 1991 to 17 billionaires by the early 2000s. Welcome to the West, comrades. For many ordinary Russians, economic liberalization had some very hard consequences. The lifting of price controls without a functioning commercial sector quickly drove up the cost of everyday essentials, and the ensuing inflation meant savings people had carefully built for years, or even decades, soon became worthless. For millions of Russians, the early reforms brought about a sharp decline in their standard of living, and the purchasing power of their salaries was cut in half. So much for blue jeans. The ruble's value was so volatile that many transactions and savings were done with US dollars. Desperate to get by, the Russian people became especially vulnerable to scams, such as the MMM Cooperative, one of the largest Ponzi schemes in history. As Prime Minister Viktor Chernomyrdin put it in 1993, "We wanted the best, but it turned out like always." Nice pep talk, coach. Real inspiring, that prime minister. Boris Yeltsin emerged as an unlikely hero during the dying days of the Soviet Union, when he helped thwart an attempted coup in August of 1991. We like to imagine that he did this like John McClane in Die Hard, alone, barefoot and crawling through the ductwork to the Kremlin. So we're not going to look into that any further. Regardless of how he pulled it off, his ensuing popularity made him well positioned to take over from Mikhail Gorbachev and lead Russia into the immediate post-communism years. To facilitate Russia's transition from a planned economy to a market economy, he requested and received extraordinary powers to facilitate the transformation. He was essentially given carte blanche for a year to enact what he called economic shock therapy. That sounds kind of terrifying, but he believed drastic reforms were necessary to reshape the economy. The catch was, the international funding needed to pull it off was conditional. Money would only be released if Russia deeply cut spending. Yeltsin promised his people that the painful reforms were necessary, and after 6 difficult months, Russia would be reborn as an economic titan. But it was a promise he could not keep. After a year, there was no sign of the promised prosperity. The deep cuts to social spending had a high human and political cost. Rather than grow the economy as hoped, the controversial reforms shrank it considerably and plunged huge swaths of the population into poverty. Yeltsin's popularity flatlined as politicians and the public demanded accountability. Vice President Alexander Vyratsky even decried the reforms as economic genocide. Apparently, this economic shock therapy was the one flew over the cuckoo's nest variety. As you might imagine, Economic genocide wasn't a terribly popular policy, so the Russian parliament sought to curb Yeltsin's power and slow down the controversial reforms, which put Yeltsin on the defensive. After months of gridlock, he finally issued Decree number 1400, the dissolution of parliament and the abolition of the constitution. Basically, he put a burn notice on Russia's brand new government. The US even tentatively backed his move. 2 days later, a special session of parliament voted to impeach the president, but their ruling was ignored as power and water were cut off from the building. Violent clashes between the police and anti-Yeltsin demonstrators broke out in Moscow. The standoff ended in October when Yeltsin ordered the military to storm the building. Russia's White House was shelled, and the uprising came to a definitive end. In the aftermath, substantial presidential powers were enshrined in law that continued to be exercised to the present day. Chechnya is a small state in the Caucasus that attempted to gain independence after the dissolution of the URSSR in 1991. Fearing other states would follow and secede from the Russian Federation, and looking for an easy military victory to bolster his sagging public support, Yeltsin ordered an invasion of Chechnya in December of 1994. What was supposed to be a cakewalk, however, became a humiliating nightmare. Why does that sound familiar? The unexpectedly fierce Chechen resistance and widespread opposition to the conflict forced the Russian troops to withdraw in 1997, just in time for Spice World. Under the terms of the peace deal, Chechnya remained part of Russia, but was effectively independent. A second conflict would break out in 1991 as a spate of terrorist attacks in Moscow were blamed on the Chechens. After Yeltsin left office at the end of 1999, the war effort would continue as his chosen successor, Vladimir Putin, upped the ante. Yeah, you knew he was going to show up. More on him in a bit. Combat operations closed by May 2000, but the insurgency took almost a decade to put down. A pro-Russian government was installed and the state was reincorporated into Russia. As Russia's economy gradually recovered from the difficult beginning of the 1990s, a new crisis was just around the corner. The Asian financial crisis of 1997 had a knock-on effect in Russia. The major economic downturn of several East Asian countries resulted in a sharp reduction in the price of oil, which fell to a low of just $11 per barrel. Is that right? $11? How can you afford not to buy a barrel of oil? You could use it as a nightstand, a bar stool. You could stand on it and play banjo. It could be the fulcrum on a seesaw. If it gets that cheap again, I'm all over that. Because billionaires tend to be tax-averse, the vast fortunes of the oligarchs were stashed offshore, and attempts to clamp down on tax evasion only made it worse. Meanwhile, the disastrous conflict with Chechnya only further depleted the state's coffers. By the fall of 1998, the Russian government began to default on domestic debts while remaining current on international obligations. The value of the ruble tumbled and millions of Russians were paid late or not at all as the crisis deepened. Inflation soared from a painful 35% at the end of 1998 to an utterly ruinous 85% the following year. It's not too surprising to learn that a majority of Russians aren't nearly as nostalgic for the 90s as Americans. As Littlefinger from Game of Thrones aptly put it, chaos is a ladder, and the chaotic conditions of the 1990s were highly favorable to the rise of a new breed of political operative. For example, the fortunes of one former mid-level KGB officer turned suddenly with the collapse of the Soviet Union. Vladimir Putin was a 17-year veteran of the agency who began his political career working for the first democratically elected mayor of St. Petersburg, Anatoly Sobchak. Putin became one of Sobchak's most trusted aides and garnered a reputation for getting things done. When Sobchak was narrowly defeated in the 1996 election, Putin refused the offer of employment with the next administration, reportedly stating, "It's better to be hanged for loyalty than to be rewarded for betrayal." That's some foreshadowing. It's like Chekhov's gun, if instead of it on the wall, it was in the pocket of a former KGB agent turned Russian politician. In 1998, Putin became the head of the FSB, the successor agency to the KGB. As Yeltsin's administration toiled under the weight of the Chechen War and the economic crisis, the idea of a strong, fierce leader who could restore order was powerful. By the fall of 1999, Putin was appointed prime minister. He became acting president just a few months later, when Yeltsin suddenly resigned on New Year's Eve, 1999. Putin's first moves as president were to consolidate his power. He saw how much his predecessor depended on the influence of the oligarchs and was determined to not fall under their sway. He offered a simple deal. They would be allowed to keep their ill-gotten gains and he would turn a blind eye to their affairs, if they would stay out of politics completely. It worked, and Putin has been large and in charge ever since, as evidenced by the many photos in which he has posed wearing blue jeans. Tsar Peter the Great of Russia was a giant of a man, with an appetite for new ideas and culture to match. He did more to modernize his country than pretty much any other ruler before or since, but he was also fairly ruthless, and maybe even a little cracked. So, today we're going to take a look at the remarkable life of Peter the Great, the physically enormous Tsar who modernized Russia. Okay, time for some big-assed facts about a big-assed Peter. Born June 9th, 1672, Pyotr Alexeyevich became Tsar of Russia when he was just 10. But at first, he was co-ruling with his half-brother Ivan. This joint rule was a result of Peter's father having children with two different wives. Both powerful families wanted a stake in ruling Russia, even if Ivan's family knew he would never be able to officially rule. Unsurprisingly, this tension between Russia's two most powerful ruling families led to violence. When Peter was still a boy, he witnessed the brutal slayings of several members of his mother's family, including two of his uncles. In all fairness, we've all probably seen one uncle get violent, but usually at a Little League game. The slayings were carried out by the Streltsy, an elite unit of guardsmen who were controlled by Ivan's family at the time. But the bad blood receded somewhat after Ivan perished when he was still quite young, leaving Peter to rule on his own. Growing up surrounded by violence and intrigue formed Peter's character, making him cautious and, at times, cruel. Everyone who saw young Peter remarked on how tall, handsome, and strong he was. In fact, he stood nearly 7 feet tall, with broad shoulders to match, in the tradition of the great Russian heroes like Zangief. So when Russians dubbed him Peter the Great, what they meant was Peter the Yoked, Peter the Swole, or depending on the local dialect, Peter the Shredded. As Tsar, Peter was determined to modernize the enormous land over which he ruled. Russia was, at the time, considered a backward country, with precious little infrastructure, almost no secular culture, and a court that was downright Byzantine. Peter's father, Alexei, had been interested in bolstering Russia's reputation in Europe. Tsar Alexei's reforms were a major influence on his son, who was determined to drag his most unwilling countrymen into the modern era. To that end, Peter arranged the Grand Embassy, a retinue of Russian noblemen and craftsmen who traveled with him to Western Europe. The intent was to learn the ways of Westerners and bring back new ideas and technology, as well as art and culture, which Peter hoped would lift his country out of the medieval era. The intent was also to take a sick European vacation on the country's dime. While Peter achieved these goals, he also did much to validate Western stereotypes of wild Russians. The Great Embassy's men, along with their Tsar, partied pretty hard. For example, in England, they were provided with an elegant house, which they promptly trashed like Motley Crue. Peter happily paid for the damages, but no money could repair the damage to his and his countrymen's reputation. There's a traditional Russian saying that holds, Peter the Great broke open windows to the West. And he certainly did. There was almost no aspect of life in Russia that Peter did not try to westernize. He even demanded his people change their style of dress, forcing all noblemen and their families to abandon kaftans, fur-trimmed hats, and other remnants of traditional Russian attire, and to don the latest fashions from Paris. This included knee breeches for men and powdered wigs and faces for everyone. Ooh la la. That is a tough sell. Sort of like ordering everyone in Boston to wear Yankees jerseys. These reforms came so swiftly and suddenly that they offended a number of Russians, noble and otherwise. But Peter didn't stop there. Next, he came for the beards. Traditionally, Russian men sported long beards, as long as they could grow, like wizards in a ZZ Top cover band. Peter saw this tradition as absurd and out of step with modern times, so he proclaimed a new law. Every man must shave off his beard. His new law met with great resistance. For some Russian men, their beard was a major symbol of their manhood. Plus, some guys just looked weird without their beard. But Peter was adamant. He even went around court with a pair of scissors, cutting off the beards of any man who dared to show up wearing one. Eventually, however, Peter compromised, declaring that if a man really wanted to keep his beard, he could do so, as long as he paid a tax. Peter the Great's reforms shocked everyone, but most everyone went along with the Tsar because, he was the Tsar. However, when he insisted upon reforming Russia's Orthodox Church, he ran into a little trouble. A small percentage of the Orthodox faithful were so opposed to Peter's reforms that they would literally rather die than adopt them. For example, there was a heated debate about how many fingers one should use when making the sign of the cross. The old believers maintained that only 2 fingers, the index and the middle finger, should be used. The reformers, however, insisted upon using 3 to represent the Holy Trinity, and because that's what the fashionably modern Westerners did. It may be hard to believe, but some took it so seriously that they actually burned themselves alive in their own churches to oppose his religious reforms. Some even claimed Peter was the Antichrist. It would be just like the devil to trick you into using too many fingers during the benediction. Not many people realize it, but Russia is 1/6 of the entire landmass on Earth. It spans from the edges of Western Europe down to the Caspian Sea, up north to the Arctic Sea, and across the steppes to Vladivostok on the Pacific shore. To borrow a phrase from Douglas Adams, you just won't believe how vastly, hugely, mind-bogglingly big it is. Yet this enormous country is very nearly landlocked. Peter knew that if Russia were to ever become a world power, it needed a navy. For centuries, the Mongols had ruled the only warm water port in Russia, the Black Sea, so the country had never developed one. While in England, Peter sought the aid of King William III, who was eager to improve trade relations with Russia. William gave Peter access to British naval bases, and even gave him a state-of-the-art English ship as a gift. He learned more shipbuilding techniques in Amsterdam, because the Dutch at that time were a great naval power. Once he got back home, Peter founded the School of Mathematics and Navigation Sciences to disseminate modern ideas within Russia. At the same time, an accelerated shipbuilding program was put into place. Because of his accomplishments, Peter is known today as the father of the Russian Navy. He was also the unofficial creator of the television show Undercover Boss. You see, Peter actually went to work in a shipyard, insisting that he be called not Tsar Peter, not Your Majesty, but Sergeant Pyotr Mikhailov. He worked just like any other man, learning all the steps needed to construct a ship. His demand for anonymity was amusing to all the other men, who knew exactly who he was. It's hard to disappear into a role when you're a 7-foot giant with a face known throughout Europe. In an effort to show that Russia could be just as modern as Europe, and also to score an epic dunk at the face of his nemesis, the Swedish king, Peter decided to build a new capital city in the northwest of Russia, on the water. And although a true port was needed for Peter's new navy, the task was considered impossible because the site he chose was a literal swamp. Building an entire city in a swamp is a bit like trying to build a swing set in a bowl of ice cream, only much more expensive. Thousands of workers perished, transforming the swamp into the city of St. Petersburg. But it achieved Peter's goal of westernizing Russia. For years, the city has been called the Venice of the North because of its large number of canals. And while the skyline is dotted with onion domes where Peter would have preferred Western-style steeples, sometimes you gotta compromise. Peter the Great's public life may have been one of enlightenment and partying, but his personal life was very different, depending on how you define partying. Peter's sole heir was the Tsarevich Alexei, and he was unhappy with how the boy turned out. Alexei was small and bookish, and loved Western culture. You'd think Peter would have at least appreciated that part, but he treated his son harshly, until Alexei left Russia for a time. Peter considered this a betrayal and demanded Alexei return, promising in letters that he would be more understanding. Unfortunately, he apparently meant he would be more understanding of enhanced interrogation techniques, because when Alexei returned home, Peter had him imprisoned and regularly beaten by his personal guards. Alexei eventually perished as a result of the harsh treatment, and Peter lost his only heir. And although he had more kids with his second wife, only one daughter, the Empress Elizaveta, survived, and she bore no children. Really, shot yourself in the foot there, Petey. While Peter's half-brother Ivan perished as a young man, he had a healthy sister, Sophia, who repeatedly schemed to seize power from him. She got her final opportunity when Peter and his retinue went west on the Great Embassy. He was the first Russian ruler ever to leave the country, so his voyage was unprecedented and risky to his rule at home. Sofia essentially took over in Peter's absence, much as she had done during his and Ivan's regency years before, when she had involved herself in 2 disastrous military campaigns led by her advisor and lover, Prince Vasily Golitsyn. Typical sibling, messing with your stuff when you leave for summer camp. But this time, she failed to consolidate her power base by the time her brother returned from the West. Peter was unamused by his sister's scheme and had Sofia permanently sent to a Moscow convent. Before you think she got off light compared to her nephew, Peter ordered Sofia's guards slain and had their bodies hung outside the windows of the convent so she could watch them rot. You know, in case the message wasn't clear. Peter the Great had a fondness for commoners, possibly due to the peasant upbringing of his beloved second wife, Catherine. When he established his table of ranks, it made him one of the first world leaders to develop a plan for citizens to rise in government and society by their personal merit rather than the nobility of their birth. Naturally, this ruffled the feathers of many nobles and high-ranking government officials. Everyone else, however, was pretty high on the idea. Although the Petrine table of ranks eventually became corrupt, it was a huge step towards democratization at a time when serfdom was still a concern. One might even compare Peter's table with the English Magna Carta. It was a step towards equality, albeit for a tiny minority. Sometimes progress is a game of inches. On August 12, 2000, the nuclear-powered Russian submarine Kursk sank in the Barents Sea for reasons unknown. It would be years before the fate of the Kursk was fully understood, and even now, there is still some controversy surrounding it. But it's hard not to wonder what happened out there that day. Today, we're going to take a look at what happened to the Russian submarine that exploded and killed 118 sailors. The Kursk submarine was a big, burly piece of Russian engineering. Specifically, the Kursk was what was known as an Oscar II Project 949A Ante, which is to say, a nuclear-powered cruise missile submarine designed and built to go after NATO aircraft carrier groups. From an engineering perspective, the Oscar IIs were built with a double hull, separated by 3.5 millimeters, and were divided into 10 different compartments. The sail had a reinforced double cover, which was designed to give the sub the ability to break through the Arctic ice cap. And at a length of about 154 meters, it was 10 meters longer than the previous Oscars. 11 of these subs were made between 1985 and 1999, and several of those are actually still in service today. These big boys were considered pretty much unsinkable. Apparently the Russians had never heard of the Titanic. So when the Kursk went down on a training exercise, it really caught them off guard. It was at 11:28 a.m. on August 12, 2000, while doing training exercises in the Barents Sea, that an explosion rocked the Kursk. The vessel quickly sank to the seabed, 354 feet below the surface, and came to a rest at the bottom of the freezing cold, watery depths. Just a little more than 2 minutes after the initial explosion, a second, more massive one took place inside the Kursk. What was supposed to be an exercise wherein the Kursk fired 2 dummy torpedoes at the Russian battlecruiser, the Pyotr Veliki, had turned into a real-life drama that had the world watching in disbelief to see if any members of the 118-member crew would survive. However, in a twist right out of a Tom Clancy novel, it would be several long, agonizing hours before anyone even knew anything was wrong. The first indication that something was amiss came when the Kursk failed to check in that evening. At that point, the Russians sent out rescue ships, which located the accident area the next morning on August 13th. All of the initial rescue attempts failed, however, due to a combination of factors, including poor weather, the angle of the Kursk, and perhaps most significantly, a lack of appropriate rescue equipment. The United Kingdom, the United States, and Norway all offered to assist with rescue operations. But apparently having seen The Hunt for Red October, the Russians refused the assistance. At least they did at first. 4 days after the initial disaster, the Russians changed their minds and agreed to accept international help. As all this was going down, the newly elected president, some rando named Vladimir Putin, was vacationing in a resort on the Black Sea. You would think losing a nuclear submarine would send the new president leaping into action, but Putin, not so much. Instead of cutting his vacation short, Putin stayed on holiday for 4 more days. While Putin claims that it wouldn't have made a difference in the handling of the incident, since he is connected to the military wherever he goes, even he admitted that in retrospect, it would have been better to return to Moscow, at least for public relations' sake. He admitted this much in an interview with the late Larry King. The delay in asking for international help may have been a major mistake. When Norwegian divers finally managed to open the Kursk's airlocks on October 21st, they did not find the survivors they were hoping for. Instead, they found that the cabin had been flooded and concluded that all 118 crewmen had been tragically killed. Saddest of all, when they found the body of Lieutenant Captain Dmitry Kolesnikov, they noticed a note in his pocket. It was written several hours after the explosions and stated that there were 23 survivors. Unfortunately, rescue crews did not arrive in time for them. Initially, some high-level Russian officials claimed that the accident was caused by a collision with a NATO submarine that was spying on the maneuvers. According to this claim, the USS Memphis collided with the Kursk and then went to a Norwegian port for emergency repairs. While there is no direct evidence that this occurred, the theory can't be completely dismissed. The Russians supported their assertion by pointing to satellite imagery of a U.S. submarine that was docked in a Norwegian port on August 19th, a few days after the accident. And a collision wouldn't have been unprecedented. There have actually been 11 such collisions recorded in the area since 1967. The explosion that ultimately destroyed the Kursk must have been massive. At least, that's what's suggested by seismic readings of the event. Here's how it went down. First, there was a small explosion that registered on seismographs. Then, 135 seconds later, there was a second explosion that was an astounding 250 times larger than the first. The second explosion was so big it registered all the way on the other side of the Arctic Circle in Alaska. Whether a collision occurred or not, the United States did admit to having submarines in the area, monitoring the Russian naval exercises. And after the initial incident, Russian dive teams found what they claimed to be a piece of a conning tower from a U.S. or British nuclear submarine. The object couldn't be raised from the seabed, however, and the Russians guarded it with warships so that no other nations could approach the debris. It was around this time that the Russians claimed the remains belonged to the USS Toledo, a different U.S. submarine that actually was docked in Scotland at the time of the accident. Not everyone is on board with the collision theory. Others have suggested that the Kursk was testing experimental torpedoes at the time of the accident. Known as the Squall, these high-speed, supercavitating rocket-propelled torpedoes are designed to travel too fast to be avoidable at close range. They can travel 230 miles per hour, which is roughly 3 to 4 times faster than any other torpedo. However, how the experimental torpedoes may have caused the accident remains unclear. Theories range from a malfunction in the Squall torpedo itself to NATO subs firing on the Kursk in order to destroy the Squall. While none of this can be entirely ruled out, the Kursk wasn't known to have had any Squall torpedoes aboard at the time of the accident. While the collision theory and the Squall theory are both plausible, the most credible and likely explanation for the accident is that it was caused by a malfunctioning torpedo, which set off a chain reaction that caused the rest of the torpedoes on the Kursk to explode. The first explosion that registered would therefore have been the initial torpedo explosion, and the second explosion would have been when the resulting fire detonated warheads on some of the Kursk's other munitions. Official intelligence reports confirm this theory. According to this explanation, far from an experimental new torpedo, the Kursk was carrying older torpedoes that used hydrogen peroxide liquid as a propellant. The use of high-test peroxide, or HTP, powered torpedoes had been stopped in British submarines after a similar accident in the 1950s. Nonetheless, it was still cleared for use by the Russian Navy in 1997. When the decision was first made to raise the Kursk from the seafloor, plans to bring up the entire submarine were rejected. Instead, the decision was made to cut off the forward torpedo compartment and leave it at the bottom of the sea. This raised some eyebrows, even though it was billed as a safety measure because the front end had an unknown amount of potentially live torpedoes still sitting in it. However, this explanation doesn't really hold up. The sub did indeed carry nuclear warheads that had to be carefully removed. Later, underwater investigations got a chance to examine the torpedo compartment and found a piece of hull debris from the number 4 torpedo hatch just 50 meters behind where the main explosion occurred. This discovery gave further credibility to the theory that a torpedo malfunctioned in the tube, starting a fire that then spread to the other torpedoes. While all these theories have their merits, there's still one more. In 2005, the French-made documentary Kursk, a submarine in troubled waters, suggested that the accident was actually caused by a combination of several theories. In this version, not only was the Kursk testing the Squall torpedo, but it was also demonstrating it to the Chinese, whom the Russians intended on selling it to. Obviously, this upset the US, which sent its own submarine in the area to observe. The USS Toledo and Memphis submarines were following the Kursk when the Toledo accidentally collided with the Kursk. This collision, according to the theory, did not register on seismographs. The Toledo retreated and then, fearing retaliation from a Squall torpedo, the Memphis opened fire on the Kursk. The torpedo from the Memphis entered the Kursk's torpedo compartment, marking the first recorded explosion. Then, the resulting fire detonated the explosives in the torpedo compartment, including the highly explosive Squalls. This was the second registered explosion, which sank the Kursk. This was followed, theoretically, by an international cover-up. Pretty elaborate. And there is no evidence to prove this exotic, all-of-the-above version. For now, the truth of what happened to the Kursk remains a mystery. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or USSR, was a communist state from 1922 to 1991, and was a big rival of the US from World War II to the end of the 80s. But what was the Soviet Union really like? And what was it like living there? Well, it turns out it's complicated. So, today we're going to take a look at things you didn't know about daily life in the Soviet Union. Okay, you don't know how lucky you are that we're going to tell you how things worked back in the USSR. From the late 40s to the early 60s, the Soviet Union had a counterculture group that aped Western beatnik and hipster culture and even made bootleg LPs. This being the USSR, the so-called styliagi, or style hunters, were forced to make the bootlegs out of recycled X-ray films. This meant the records had ghostly bones all over them, which, to be honest, sounds pretty badass. The styliagi were, in the words of one style blogger, a group of dandy youngsters dressed up in colorful American-inspired get-ups that were unafraid to make a bold fashion statement. Those critical of the styliagi claimed, "Today he dances jazz, but tomorrow he will sell his homeland." Talk about your slippery slopes. McDonald's and Coca-Cola are often cited as being the two American companies with the most worldwide influence and reach. But it was actually Pepsi-Cola that made it into the USSR first. Yeah, Pepsi was available in the Soviet Union a full 21 years before McDonald's and 16 years before Coca-Cola. It had a lot to do with Pepsi's appearance at an exhibit at Moscow's Sokolniki Park in 1959, where the soda was given out for free in disposable paper cups. The Soviets struck a deal with Pepsi a decade later that also included the distribution rights for Stoli vodka. Despite the head start, however, Coke would catch up, and as of 2020, Coca-Cola was the most popular non-alcoholic beverage in Russia. Pepsi was second. But speaking of beverages, famous beer lovers like Homer Simpson and Norm Peterson might have loved Russia because, while this sounds wild, it wouldn't be until 2011 that beer came to be defined as an alcoholic beverage in the former Soviet nation. Prior to that, legislation classified it as a foodstuff, meaning it could be sold like a soft drink. This meant it could be sold in street kiosks and could be imbibed openly in just about any public place in the country. Now, to be clear, this wasn't because the Russians didn't know beer was alcoholic or anything like that. It was really a legal consequence of an international trade pact known as the Nice Agreement. The agreement classified hard liquor and beer as two different types of goods. something Russian liquor producers spent years trying to change without success. In any case, alcohol in general was wildly popular during the Soviet era. In fact, when Mikhail Gorbachev, the country's head of state from 1990 through 1991, tried to pass a dry law that raised the price of booze and restricted when and what quantities it could be sold, it affected his popularity. Some historians think it even hastened his downfall. Studies have shown that Gorbachev's program correlated with a rise in life expectancy and a drop in criminal behavior. On the other hand, it cost the country about 100 billion rubles in tax revenues and became a massive source of income to organized criminals and black marketeers. So it was a mixed bag, or a mixed drink in this case. In an era when everything is made to be constantly replaced and upgraded, it's hard to remember that there was once a time when things were built to last, like, for example, Soviet cars. According to Russian author Alexander Kabakov, from the 1930s to the 1950s especially, car owners in the Soviet Union took great pride in making their vehicles last as long as possible, and in some cases, they lasted a lifetime. It wasn't just careful owners that gave these vehicles their longevity. Quality control on the manufacturing end was a huge part of it, and so was build quality. In fact, Kabakov says the metal frames were so thick coming off the line, they were basically resistant to corrosion. Everyone's heard of long Soviet bread lines, but that's not even the half of it. Even a self-proclaimed well-off American student living in Moscow in the mid-60s said that getting any food at all was a tremendous chore. According to Dr. Naomi F. Collins, she was constantly in a state of exhaustion just from the efforts of daily living. Even buying staples like cheese and rice took forever because you had to stand in long lines for nearly every item you wanted. And even after waiting, you didn't get the item directly. You had to get vouchers at each station and pay a cashier before going back to the stations and picking up your items. Soviet authorities in Stalin's time considered private kitchens, dining rooms, and even apartments to be dangerous to the regime. So an idea was tossed around in the early days to force people to eat in communal cafeterias. It sounds like a storyline from a Dr. Strangelove-type political farce, but so-called kitchen politics were actually considered such a threat that Soviet leaders wanted houses built without kitchens at all. It wasn't just about preventing people from having privacy. The idea was also meant to relieve a housewife from her daily chores, so that she could develop as a personality, and free the country from the Tsarism, and bring happiness to poorer classes. Because I guess we all know cooking only brings sorrow? Not surprisingly, the idea did not pan out. And soon, widespread industrialization led to over 100 different ethnic groups all being served the same exact meals, such as canned soup, meat, and fish. A New York Times feature from 1989 reveals quite a bit about the Soviet attitude regarding the poor and the homeless in the last few years of the USSR. One Western diplomat is quoted as saying that Soviet officials stopped gathering statistics on poverty because they insisted it simply did not exist. When presented with the idea of combating the issue with American-style soup kitchens, one Soviet official even said, "We are opposed to this system, where poor people get free dinner. Psychologically, it's a strange idea to us. We will not consider such a variant." They probably should have considered such a variant, however, since the state of the Soviet economy made earning one's dinner incredibly difficult. In fact, in 1989, it took a Soviet worker 10 times longer to earn a pound of meat than it did the average American. But not everyone was having a hard time getting the foods they wanted. In 1984, the year, not the George Orwell novel, Konstantin Mtsimis reported that despite there being a nationwide food shortage, the ruling elite in Moscow ate like kings using the so-called Kremlyovska Stolovya, or Kremlin Canteen. The canteen was a network of special stores that sold food of particularly high quality to those with special passes. Sausages, fish delicacies, cheeses, bread, vodka, cakes, as well as fruits and vegetables produced and grown on state farms that supply the canteen system exclusively. There were also American cigarettes, Scotch whiskey, English gin, and pharmacies that sold prescriptions you couldn't find anywhere else in the country. Joseph Stalin really did not like the gay community. Soviet-era documents declassified in 1993 show he personally insisted on the passage of an anti-homosexual law. He got his wish in 1933 when Article 121, which expressly prohibited male homosexuality, was added to the criminal code. Once in effect, such activity was punishable by up to 5 years of hard labor in prison. Stalin wanted the law due to a report from the Soviet secret police that warned of pederast activists holding orgies and engaging in espionage. Throughout the Soviet era, being openly gay meant facing prison or even hard labor. Not only that, gay people were widely considered pedophiles and fascists, and still are in parts of modern Russia, where homophobia still lingers. Stalin's anti-gay legacy lingered into the mid-90s, after the fall of the Soviet Union. Gay people in prison for sodomy didn't even receive amnesty when the laws that put them there were repealed in 1993. Facing accusations of religious obscurantism and anti-communism, heavy metal bands such as Black Sabbath, Nazareth, Iron Maiden, and Judas Priest were on a secret blacklist kept by the Soviets and distributed to party officials in 1985. It wasn't just heavy metal that threatened the establishment, though. Plenty of pop and indie acts made the list too. Bands like Talking Heads, The Village People, and 10cc were listed in the document, which was written up for the purpose of intensifying control over the activities of discotheques. The translated title of the blacklist, by the way, was The Approximate List of Foreign Musical Groups and Artists Whose Repertoires Contain Ideologically Harmful Compositions. It's hard not to be amused by a totalitarian regime feeling threatened by the village people. It's hard to imagine a capitalist government using its citizens to stop the production of tasteless bric-a-brac, but that's exactly what the Soviets did. The Soviets apparently hated kitsch, at least in the early days. In 1928, the state-run newspaper Komsomolska Pravda even launched a campaign called Down with Domestic Trash. Why? According to the state-run newspaper, all these dogs, mermaids, figurine devils, and elephants only help smuggle back mishchanstva. Mishchanstva, for the record, is a virtually untranslatable term meaning preoccupation with every day. I wonder how they'd feel about Funko Pop figures. Jewish people living in the Soviet Union after World War II were forced to hide matzah in pillowcases inside suitcases and transport it when visiting relatives because baking it inside synagogues was explicitly forbidden. Matzah, for those who don't know, are the flat crackers Jews eat to commemorate Passover. The Soviet secret police would patrol synagogues to enforce the rule, so Jewish families in the URSSR had to get secretive themselves. It's odd to think of making crackers as an act of rebellion, but it was. A man named Slava Frumkin, who lived through it all, says it was a point of pride. It was like a sense of secrecy around this, and it was filling, to some degree, with some pride, your heart. You're doing something secretly that the government doesn't want. Yes, the staples that held together Soviet passports were made from an inferior metal that could corrode and get rusty. This may seem like a bug, but it was actually a feature, and for secret agents trying to use fake passports, it was a huge deal. Unlike passports in the USSR, American passports used stainless steel staples. So anyone trying to pass their fake Soviet passport off as a real one gave themselves away if they were using the wrong staples. A Russian FSB, or Federal Security Service, official told the Chicago Tribune that hundreds of American agents got caught because they didn't know this. It's always the little things. So what do you think? What Soviet fact surprised you? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're at it, check out some of these other videos from our weird history.